everyone. I'm your host, Tom Shaughnessy, and welcome back to Chain Reaction, a research-driven podcast that's a part of Delphi Digital. If you're not on Delphi's research portal, you're missing out on the critical analysis read by the top minds in the crypto space, so be sure to check it out. One quick housekeeping item. Nothing said on this podcast is a solicitation to buy or sell any security or token or to make any financial decisions. Hey guys, I also wanted to tell you about Zenledger, the best tax software for cryptocurrency investors and accountants. It's fast and easy to use, and you can get all of your crypto transactions in one place so you can trade smarter and optimize your taxes. Zenledger offers 24/7 customer support by phone, email, or chat to help you get your taxes done stress-free, and it comes with a 100% money-back guarantee because they know you'll love it. Zenledger is giving an exclusive 15% discount to our listeners when you use coupon code CHAIN15. Go to zenledger.io, linked in the show notes below, to get started and get your taxes done fast. With that, let's jump into the episode. Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm thrilled to have on Brian Klein, who's a partner at Baker Marquardt. How's it going, Brian?
It's going great, other than the obvious global pandemic and calamity, but at least it's a nice sunny day here in Los Angeles, and my family and I are safe and healthy, so that's nice.
Yeah, it's all that matters at the end of the day, right? It's Brian, it's a pleasure to have you on. It goes without saying that I think a lot of people in the space know you as the lawyer that comes up whenever there's a very high stakes case in the space.
That's, a very high compliment.
I'd love to hear your background and kind of how you got started and kind of first heard about Bitcoin and crypto.
I'm not going to go back to the very beginning. After I graduated from law school, this was in 2000. I worked at a number of bigger firms, including in New York City. Eventually, I found my way to LA to serve as a federal prosecutor. The job I had immediately before that was I worked for a lawyer named Ben Brathman, who's a very well-known criminal defense attorney. He has represented people like Harvey Weinstein, Plaxico Burress, Michael Jackson. So just a who's who of high-profile celebrities or sports stars or people who get in some sort of trouble. And I grew up in California, in the Bay Area, and I always wanted to return to California, or at least the West Coast, and really loved LA and was excited to be a federal prosecutor here for 5 years. When I left, and this was in 2012, end of 2012, I went to a litigation boutique where I am now, Baker Marquardt. Our firm is actually in the process of changing its name. We're going to be moving to a trade name, which is not a person's last name like we have now, or two people's names, but a name like Google or Facebook. We're not taking those names, of course. And I really liked my firm. It was a litigation boutique, which means all we do is litigation at a very high level, in California and other places around the country. And I had wanted to build my own white-collar criminal defense practice. The firm only did civil work, and so this was a chance for me to sort of spread my own wings and do that. And I remember in early 2013, I had read, somewhere in the back of my mind, I had heard about Bitcoin. It wasn't like on my radar per se. I'd always been interested in technology, having grown up in the Bay Area. And I read the FinCEN guidance. And that really piqued my interest. And FinCEN is an arm of the Department of Treasury that is responsible for, stopping terrorist financing and money laundering. And they had put out some very specific guidance about virtual currencies, what they called at the time. Really, there was just Bitcoin out there. There were a few other coins, but really it was Bitcoin. And it was talking about how they felt that their regulations covered Bitcoin, so they could sort of regulate Bitcoin. And that was, really caught my attention because that's a very sort of serious old school agency in DC that, here it was talking about this bright, shiny new object. And I did what a lot of people did is when they first sort of Bitcoin hear about it and sort of captures their interest, Googled about it and just sort of fell down the rabbit hole. Now, back then there was a lot less of a rabbit hole to fall down. There was the white paper, and there were some commentary, among libertarians or technologists or cryptographers. But in early 2013, there wasn't really a lot out there. And from there, things just kind of took off. I ended up speaking at one of the first Bitcoin conferences, major ones in San Jose, that was put on by the Bitcoin Foundation, and got involved with the Bitcoin Foundation on a volunteer basis, and got introduced to clients or met them at that conference. That conference was classic early days Bitcoin conference. It was the Winklevoss twins were the keynote speakers. It was very bare bones. There wasn't the venture capital money or even any of the outside interest in Bitcoin, really. I remember being basically card tables with small signs. And I still have some T-shirts from that. I think I have a BitInstant T-shirt. In fact, I know I do. I just saw it recently, which was a service Charlie Shrem and others ran. And was really fascinated from the technology. I can't say I got all the cryptography part, and I can't say I still do. I'm not a cryptographer. I'm not a technologist. But, I really, the idea of money or value that wasn't attached or dependent on a government, that was freely movable around the world, that basically in an instant. It's a very powerful idea. And also the idea that it solved sort of all these problems that people had not been able to solve, like the double spend problem, which was the first thing that I thought of, like, how can someone could just copy this? And of course, Satoshi thought of that, and put in place the proof of work system. So that was the start for me.
That's
early 2013.
Yeah, you go back a ways. That's great that you got started so early in the space. Were you, at first glance, when you first read the FinCEN guidance in 2013, were you impressed with their level of depth and understanding, or did you think that, hey, these guys may need to do a little bit more research?
I didn't have a real sense for things at that time. I read it first and then learned more about Bitcoin. And as I learned more, I spoke to more people. And there were a few early lawyers in the space. People like Marco Santori and Patrick Merck. And, they pointed out some of the things that it missed or shortcomings, and others did too. There wasn't really if I remember, I haven't looked at it in a while, but there were some gaps. There were some definite gaps. And also, query whether, they were right in terms of many things. But I think I was impressed with the idea that they took it seriously, because the fact that they were taking it seriously was telling me that other people in government were taking it seriously. And it means that people thought it was going to be important, not just people in the small circles in Silicon Valley or libertarian circles of cryptographers, but now was sort of, rippling throughout the country and the world. And, you had a really sort of old school agency that isn't like known, and payments haven't been known for a ton of innovation, or particularly money for a ton of innovation. There was, of course, things like PayPal and other services, but, here was actually, those were still dealing with dollars, right? Or fiat currency. And Bitcoin was mind-blowing. I do think, having met with FinCEN people that fall, some people from the Bitcoin Foundation went and met with FinCEN. They were genuinely very curious and open to feedback. And I think I felt that they wanted to get it right. Whether I agreed that them getting it right was what I would have done, or others would do, is different. But there was definitely a genuine openness to trying to understand the technology. And some people were, frankly, as curious and fascinated by it as I was, right? It was something that was, this bright, shiny new thing at the time, and very interesting to people.
Yeah, it's interesting you paint the narrative to kind of understand the times, because it's not only 2013 when there's limited research and information out there on Bitcoin, but it's also a government agency that's not within the crypto community or echo chamber building these things. So it is really cool to kind of see them get involved in such an early stage.
Yeah, and they wanted to engage with the community, right? They had invited the foundation to come and talk to them and others. So I thought that was positive. I think whether I agree with all the government agencies' positions, in general, I think they've all been very open to educating themselves and trying to understand what's happening. And I think that's, that is one thing that I think speaks very well of them. No one said, "Oh, I don't want to learn about that. I don't want to know about that. We've already made up our mind." I mean, there's some politicians who say things like that, but the actual people who are involved with the agencies or law enforcement who are handling these matters, across the board, I think there's been a lot of willingness to learn and understand and one desire to understand.
No, that's important. So I guess, how do you think that the FinCEN's thinking around the space has kind of improved or digressed since you first saw that paper? I mean, we don't have to get into any specific points, but I mean, they've come out with a lot of comments, a lot of reports, a lot of speeches on, how FinCEN's kind of Bank Secrecy Act and AML regulations could apply to the space. But I'm kind of wondering, do you think that, they've improved their message and their stance since then? Or do you think that it may have gone off the rails? I'm just not sure directionally what you're thinking.
Yeah, I think, look, without going too deep, they've gotten some things right and they've gotten some things wrong, what I would say. Overall, they're a smaller, more nimble agency, and they have a lot more freedom to sort of do things than maybe a bigger agency would do. So I think they, in broad generalities, they've gotten some things right and some things wrong. I think they've been trying to hone and improve their message. They issued some guidance, additional guidance last year, which I think they felt was sort of pretty definitive. I will say, I think they should have been, rather than issuing guidance, should have been following the rulemaking process. And a lot of agencies have gotten away from that, which is they would just say, "Oh, this is our guidance." And that's actually not binding law. But they treat it as if it's binding law. It's sort of this, you're in this weird position where it's their basically interpretation of their own rules, versus there's actually, and I don't do this work, but there's a whole process for rulemaking where you get comments and other things. And I think in general, I would have preferred if they had gone that route. But I think there was a need for some sort of proclamation on this at some point.
That's a good point. So I guess around this time, is this when one of your earliest cases, I think, was representing Eric Voorhees, who I think is definitely a visionary in the space, founder, CEO, Shapeshift. Did you start representing Eric soon after you first came across that FinCEN doc, or did it take some time?
I mean, it took some time, but Eric, I had met, I think that in 2013. And then, I later ended up representing him in the SEC case, which he entered into a settlement with in 2014. So it was in that time frame that we got to know each other, and I helped him out with that, resolving that case, which I think in a very favorable manner to him, is how it's been viewed. And I was glad to help him get that behind him. And he's now, like you said, I think he is a real visionary and has done a lot of great things for the space in general. He's a very kind and generous and thoughtful person.
Yeah, I'm with you there. It must have been interesting representing a case so early, right? Because, how much of this is like, you delving into a new crypto sphere and negotiating with plaintiffs versus kind of, business as normal. Hey, this is just another case. Like, I'm sure that the idea of representing Eric kind of sparked some interest in doing something new for you, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of the things about the space in general was there weren't a lot of other lawyers in the space at that time. One, it was very small, right? The total market cap of coin cap or Bitcoin was probably around $1 billion or just under or over, depending on the day. So it was a very small space. I don't think, I thought it was going to blow up and be big, but, that was not the position shared by most of the world. A lot of the world thought, Bitcoin was this crazy fraud Ponzi scheme. I don't know, just sort of this view that was sort of very reactionary and based on not really trying to understand both the technology and the concepts. So it was a different time. I think the SEC attorneys who were involved, they were learning, and but they also had a lot of knowledge too. They had spent time understanding things, what Bitcoin was. And I think the SEC had at least certain people at the SEC, and Valerie Suspanic, who's now the head of FinHub, was involved in that settlement. She was very knowledgeable and thoughtful about Bitcoin and always curious and wanted to know more.
It's great that you're saying that the SEC is up to speed and learning in the space. I think that's great to hear. And you mentioned earlier that
I don't always agree with them, just to be clear.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point.
I am just saying, I think they have spent a lot of time trying to understand tokens, cryptocurrency, how they will work. For sure. I know they had I don't know if they still do, but various times they've had large sort of working groups on this. So they've spent a lot of resources trying to understand it. They've also spent a lot of resources investigating people and companies and bringing enforcement actions against them.
So a lot of people in the crypto space feel like, hey, the government doesn't know what they're doing. They don't understand crypto. But I feel like, based on your comments, they're not only spending a lot of time to learn about this, but these are hardworking people that are basically doing what they think their job is, right? Like, when do you think that you'll kind of get that internal government push to really understand the stuff, so that when people are doing their daily jobs, the government, they really understand the space, if that's the right question?
Well, I think a lot of that is just people, and myself included, don't like all the positions the government takes on this, right? So, I don't agree with a lot of the positions and actions the government brings here in the space. But it doesn't mean I don't think they're trying to understand it. And I think in my dealings with people, for the most part, with very few exceptions, have been, pleasant and thoughtful, even when we've disagreed vehemently on certain points. So I think, it's always easy from the outside to throw stones, whoever you are in whatever situation. But the reality on the ground is not, it's always different, right? When you get into it, when you're actually dealing with this day to day. Just like I think some people in the government think that a lot of these entrepreneurs are, maybe not as professional as they could be, or acting recklessly sometimes when they're really navigating a lot of tricky issues, a lot of uncertainty, both by the government and the marketplace. So I think there probably could be better understanding by everybody.
No, that's fair. And so, you've progressed amazingly in the space. You went from representing Eric and getting involved early to representing, I don't believe it was Tezos. I believe it was Arthur and Kathleen at Tezos. And then you also represented Block One. These are major cases in the space. I don't know exactly what the right question to ask here is, but I guess, how was representing these, major clients in the space? And I guess, how do you think the impact of the results will be in the crypto space itself?
Well, I've been very lucky to have a lot of great clients. Block One, Arthur and Kathleen among them, and get a lot of referrals from prior clients to new clients, which is always the highest compliment you can get as a lawyer, when one client recommends you to someone else who has an issue, whether it's civil, criminal, or regulatory. So, I am huge fans of Arthur and Kathleen. We just settled their class actions, although they have to be technically approved by the court, and that process takes a little while. And then Block One, obviously, we had the settlement there with the SEC. I've had a number of other terrific and interesting clients. I represented Charlie Shrem in his dispute with the Winklevoss twins and their company last year. Got that settled, and Charlie's, a terrific guy and a really great client to have, and just a lot of fun to be around. And his story is, fascinating. Sort of, he was in very early with FinCEN, made some serious mistakes, paid his dues, came out, it's really, I think he would tell you this and tell anybody he's really matured and has perspective and, is really doing things the right way now and, enjoying life. So I think I've been very fortunate and, you just try to do the best you can for each client each time, right? That's all you can do as a lawyer is try to be the best advocate you can be for them. Sometimes that is in the courtroom. Sometimes that's in meetings before things are public. A lot of my cases never get public attention. And I think a lot of lawyers would say this, or litigators would say some of their biggest, best victories are the cases you never get to read about because the lawsuit was never filed or the enforcement action or indictment was never brought. And that's definitely true. There's been a number of times where I've helped people out of real jams and, they've been able to move on without going through a real meat grinder of a process, which any type of litigation can be. It's, taxing both financially, but also like emotionally, mentally. Litigation is a real grind if you're involved in it.
That's a really good point. I guess, these are really high profile cases. I guess the question here is, do you think that we're getting these large cases because it's a product of the space getting bigger? Or do you think that eventually, since you're going through all these cases, the space will get cleaned up, people will know how to act, the government will, potentially become a little more up to speed on the space? Like, do you think that this is a product of getting the space to mature? Or do you think that it's just a lot of confusion?
I sort of would take that question a little differently, which is I think you're always going to have disputes between parties. That's just human nature, whether it's between people, between companies, between the government and people, the government and companies. I don't think disputes are going away anytime soon, frankly, ever. So there's always going to be need for lawyers. There's always going to be need for people to help represent and advocate for somebody. I think the disputes, the size of them, represents the times. Eric's case, the dollar value of that was relatively low. And the dollar values have gotten a lot higher now that you've seen the space grow, right? Whether it's the amount raised through token events, or it's the amount that companies are fighting over. Those just amounts have grown tremendously as the value of Bitcoin and other tokens have, skyrocketed. When I first got involved, I think I got my first Bitcoin for around $80, $90, $100,
I'm jealous.
Well, I didn't buy enough. Everyone would say that. That's one thing about Bitcoin. You never bought enough. But I think that, this, like I said, the size and the scope of the disputes grows just like any marketplace. And it just reflects a maturing marketplace or an expanding one. So I don't think disputes are going to go away. Look, you still have the SEC brings cases against the big banks all the time or big companies. Just because, they've been around for a long time doesn't mean they're still not getting enmeshed in inquiries or investigations, right? So, and there's lawsuits between big financial institutions regularly and hedge funds and private equity shops. There's nothing about that is a reflection of the length of time the industries have been around. It's just more a reflection of humans by their nature are going to get into disputes. And when there's money involved or other things involved, as that gets bigger, the disputes are going to get bigger.
When these clients approach you, and you have obviously amazing clients. I'm huge fans of Arthur and Kathleen and others you mentioned. What's something that you wish they did or didn't do before they call you? Or is there any mistake that clients make before they, get on retainer with you?
There's never, I hate to say the word mistakes. In hindsight, you can always find things you would have done differently. That's just the way human nature is. It's like hindsight bias, right? You would look back and you'd say, oh, well, knowing this now, I would have done this differently, right? It's really hard to answer that question. I think one thing people can do to help them avoid disputes, is, there's lots of usually opportunities to resolve things before the lawyers need to get involved. And sometimes people take things very personally and it gets in the way of resolving disputes. And that's one thing a lawyer is good about doing, is coming in and being more objective, right? And stepping back and saying, okay, I see your point, but we have to account for these issues too, right? So I think, That's one issue. And it's very hard. It's very hard to remove yourself from a dispute. We all know that from our own personal lives, right? Objectively, you can say it's dumb to argue over this, but you still do it anyways.
Yeah.
Whether it's with a sibling or a significant other. So, I mean, I think that's one thing, but that I don't think you can really change. I think for the most part, I think you're always better off if you're sort of doing things for the right reason, which most people are, right? Even if it sort of gets the attention of another party for some reason. It's sort of when you do something for a bad reason, right? Like, and I'm not saying this is what people set out to do, but clearly some people do. If you go rob a bank, you're obviously intending to go into the bank and take money in the bank that you're not supposed to have, right? You know that when you go in to rob a bank. I don't represent bank robbers, but people I do represent most times are doing things for the right reason. Just things in life can get confused, mixed up. The other party can interpret things wrongly or not have the full context. It's sort of my job to help paint the full picture and correct that.
No, a middleman is very much worth it there. So, Brian, we spoke a lot earlier about FinCEN, and you said they're an old age kind of government institution, and they're obviously very early. But I feel like the SEC gets a lot more attention now. I mean, they have cases against Telegram and Kick, and a bunch of other projects they're arguing with or litigating against. What's your take on the SEC's perspective here and how their role will eventually shake out in the space?
Well, I think they've been very aggressive in bringing enforcement actions. I would say in general, I feel like they should have brought a lot fewer of those. And I think that, they've, I would say, I think they're wrong in Kick and I think they're wrong in Telegram, to be clear. They've made their arguments in courts why they think they're right. I think they've taken a lot of positions about the Howey test that I disagree with vehemently. So they haven't been able to resolve those disputes without litigation, with Kick or Telegram, which is why they brought it to the court, right?
Brian, that's an interesting part on the Howey test. What's your biggest disagreement there?
I think, look, what I would say is, and not to get too into the weeds here on it, but I think, there's a lot of backfilling. We're like, well, we think this is a security and we'll fit it into the definition. And I don't think that's the case with a lot of these projects. There are, of course, examples of projects that do meet the Howey test, not even outside the space, inside the space, right? I mean, I'm not going to say there are no examples of that, but they've really taken a very broad view of it, overly broad view of it, in my opinion. And I think, the Howey test was clearly focused on what is an investment contract, what are the elements to get to one. And I think their interpretation of those elements is often overly broad, or is overly broad, and wrong many times. And so I think, I'm in the corner of Telegram and Kick in their cases. And I hope the appellate court, the Second Circuit, overturns the district court in Telegram. And I know Kick has the motion for summary judgment before the district court judge. In this case, the SEC filed one too. And I'm hoping that Kick is victorious there also. So I think the SEC has a role to play, of course. And I think, protecting mom and pop investors and sort of doing a lot of things. And obviously they have played a long role in our country in doing things, but I think they've been overly aggressive and overreached in many cases here in the crypto industry. And I think, my views on that are well known. Now, it doesn't mean that they haven't gotten it right in some cases, and doesn't mean that, my clients that I've represented haven't settled things, and I'm not disputing those settlements. But, I still have a number of very active matters in front of the SEC that aren't public, and I'm hoping that those all get resolved favorably for my clients as soon as possible.
It's really great color. I mean, it's wild that the Howey test is such an old test. I mean, was it like 70 or 80 years old? I guess, when do we get to a point, or like, what's the path forward? Like, do you have to get precedents in the space that, hey, this isn't, this doesn't satisfy the Howey test, so, projects in the future won't have to go through this? Or do you have to have like a re-envisioning of what the Howey test is and some new type of rulemaking? Like, how do you move the space forward so every project doesn't have to go through this?
I think, well, there's a couple ways forward. I think the best would be for the SEC to just have a lighter touch in general, and focus on cases it views as those involving fraud, and focusing less on what it views as unregistered offering cases. But I would say that we're probably waiting for circuit courts and maybe even the Supreme Court to make a decision. The district court ruling in Telegram is not binding on other courts. They've now appealed it to the Second Circuit, which is the appellate court for that region of the country, New York, etc. And if that rules, then that becomes binding precedent for that region. And the Second Circuit has a lot of moral authority over other circuits because it's a very active circuit and has a lot of high-profile, interesting cases. So I think you're going to need appellate courts to weigh in on some of these issues. I think the SEC is not going to change their mind. They've laid out a framework. FinHub has. They've brought their cases. They've made their positions clear. So I think to resolve this dispute, you're going to need some appellate courts to weigh in, maybe even the Supreme Court someday.
That's fair. And I hate to discount all of the work that goes into the Telegram and kick cases, because there's obviously a ton of work. But do you think that there is a good chance that either project will come out of this favorably, or do you think that the government has its sights set and, these guys are kind of screwed?
Well, I mean, look, if they win in court, they're going to win. So if Telegram wins its appeal, that's a big win for them. If Kick wins its motion for summary judgment, that's a huge win for them. So I think, these cases will decide a lot of things for those two projects. It's possible, I'm not saying Telegram's going to do this, but they could choose to refund the money, right? The funds, and make the case moot. They've given no indication they're going to do that, though, based on the fact that they filed an appeal or notice of an appeal. So I think, we're just going to see how this all plays out. It's not going to play out quickly either. I think people, you watch TV or movies and you think, oh, court cases start and they end pretty, within 2 hours, right? Or Law and Order, 30 minutes. But, it's going to take a while for an appellate court to hear it and then issue a ruling. And you can either side will, my guess, Telegram would likely appeal to the Supreme Court. Whether they'll hear it or not will take some time. If they choose to hear it, that would take a long time. So you're talking a long time now. And particularly with the pandemic, courts have, generally speaking, slowed things down because they're operating under very heavy restrictions. A lot of trials have been suspended in many places, not all places. So, this could be the time frame for this being resolved could be years.
Yeah, it's a long timeline. I am one of the kids who grew up watching Law and Order, so I'm used to those 5-minute trials at the end.
Yeah, exactly.
So 2 philosophical questions, Brian, to close out. I wanted to get your thoughts on. So there's a lot of debate within the crypto community about developers who write code and if they should be liable for the code that they write. I saw some crazy tweets the other day that developers should have insurance or some certification before they could write code. It kind of destroys the entire point of building new applications. But how do you kind of feel about that view that developers who write code should be liable to those who use it?
Would generally just favor that, although of course, the devil's in the details on that, right? Did they write the code specifically to give to one person to do one thing? Someone came to you and said, please write the code for me so I can unlock this bank lock so that I can take the money that's not mine. And you did that. I think you probably have an issue, right?
Totally.
If it was, I'm writing a program so that you can, a word processing program, and then somebody happens to take that word processing program and do something totally unknown and unexpected with it, that's a different scenario. So I think it's a spectrum, but I'm generally lean towards or strongly lean towards, free speech and liberty and those sort of values. By nature, I'm mostly a libertarian. And so I think that, the government should tread very cautiously in this area and be very careful about what it does here. If it's going to bring charges or create some sort of liability for coding, it needs to be very well thought out and very specific and very clear and not vague or open to abuse by an overzealous government official.
Yeah, I'm with you there. A lot of the new like DeFi type projects are founded by people, with an internet connection and their laptop, and they just want to write some code. And to be honest, most of the time there's hacks and exploits. And, I kind of view that as growing pains in the space and, kind of a product of an early tech industry. But a lot of people in the space are starting to view these developers as, potentially personally liable. And, I'm with you. I guess the other side of it is, how do we know that this person was actually good natured,
I mean, it's a very lawyer answer, but it really depends a lot on the circumstances. We could all make a case that they shouldn't have liability for what they did, and I'm sure there's a case where we could all clearly see that they should. So it really just depends on the facts and circumstances. But in general, I would err on the side of caution when creating some sort of liability for them. And we all benefit by people being innovative, thinking creatively, and assuming they're doing so with like goodwill, right, and in good faith, and trying to be a good citizen. That is sort of, we all benefit from that. So I would want to do as little as possible to tamp down on those sort of animal spirits. I think it's the capitalist word for it, right?
Yeah, I'm with you there. And last question for you, Brian, not for a lob, but Ross Ulbricht, founder of Silk Road, do you think he'll ever get out of prison, or do you think negative on that one?
I think it's very unlikely that he will ever get out of prison. I think that sentence was too harsh. I think that people obviously there are cases where people merit life sentences, terrorists, mass murderers, and we can come up with them. People who prey on children, child molesters. But I think Ross, who was a young man, should have at least been given some hope of getting out some point. I think the judge sentenced him incredibly harshly. I don't think he should have been sentenced to life. And I hope that someday he is able to get out. I think it's maybe possible towards the end of his life that could happen. It will be sad that his probably, the conditions. I think he's in a supermax, which are very harsh conditions. So I'm hoping that at least someday he gets to move to a more relaxed facility and enjoy more freedoms in prison, although it's still prison. There's a big difference between the camps and the supermax facilities. So,
yeah, that's fair. It's definitely a big difference.
I don't want to give false hope. It's he's been sentenced, and it's been appealed up to the Supreme Court, and it's been upheld. So, it would take some real extraordinary measures for it to change.
Yeah, I'm with you there. That is a really harsh penalty. I think he got double life and 40 years, I think, without any possibility of parole. It just sounds insane when you think about it.
Yeah, thankfully, during this pandemic, a lot of judges are letting people early or showing a lot of mercy towards people, letting them report later or letting them come out early, particularly if they're nonviolent or vulnerable populations. I hope that will send a message to judges and the prosecutors. I hope it resonates with them that a lot of these people were in prison for way too long and should have been released earlier. I think a lot of our sentences are way too long, particularly for nonviolent first-time offenders. I think there's a lot of people in prison who should not be there as long as they should be. So I'm hopeful that this pandemic will have some positive effects on that, and that in the future we'll see more humanitarian sentences resumed.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I mean, everybody I think is aware of, just as a side note, all the people with drug-related offenses. These people go to prison for small quantities of some drug, and then things happen in prison and they're there for the rest of their lives. It's just horrible to see that.
Yes, I think those drug sentences for nonviolent drug offenders are particularly problematic, and I think starting the Obama administration, they started to do some things to loosen that. I think they could still do more, but I think at least they took a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Well, Brian, it's incredible to have you on, especially given your experience representing top people in the space and top projects. Where could people reach out?
They should feel free to email me. My email address is bklein@bakermarquardt.com. I think if they type, you can probably put it in the show notes if you don't mind. And then I would just hope that everyone is staying safe, doing well, and we all get through this as soon as possible. And it's really hard to see people suffering right now and losing loved ones, and they can't even go see them in a hospital or they're sick or dying. So I think we all, it's sort of that is the bigger picture that we all are living in right now, and I hope that we all get through that as soon as possible.
No, I'm with you there, Brian, and I appreciate your time. I'll send all those links in the show notes, so anybody listening, you can just scroll down. You can check out those links. View Brian's site. His Twitter's also down if you just scroll down. And Brian, it's been incredible having you on.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I've enjoyed talking with you, Tom, and stay safe.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to the podcast. If you enjoyed it, please support the show by hitting subscribe on iTunes, writing a review, or sharing this episode on Twitter and LinkedIn. And stay tuned for our next episode, out soon.